Hello, welcome to another episode of Album Musings. So in this episode we're going to be taking a look at Def Leppard's Pyromania, released on the 20th of January 1983. So that is 40 years from when this episode is going out. So yeah, we're now currently January 2023. So yeah, 40 years. So I'm going to, again, as usual, talk a little bit about how this fared in the UK charts, both in terms of the album itself and the subsequent singles. I'm going to weave my own sort of personal recollections of the album as I go along with this album, because my timeline in terms of musical appreciation does line up chronologically with Def Leppard, in terms of a lot of the albums were bought at the same time they came out. So yeah, it makes it easy to do that, and I'm not going to talk much at the end about other links, because it's the stuff that's most relevant to this particular episode revolves around my own recollections of the bands and what maybe went wrong in the UK around this time or prior to this that explains the lack of success of this album relative to how well it did in the States. So, 20th of January 1983, third studio album, first to feature Phil Collen, who replaced founding member Pete Willis. I'll see if I can find, there's a really good documentary which covers that period and what was going on. So Pete Willis generally was sort of battling alcohol-related problems. There were problems during the recording of the album as a result of that, and Pete Willis was let go of, and they got in Phil as the replacement. Now, the rhythm guitar tracks had already been recorded, so when we look at the musician listing, the personnel listing on the album, you'll see that Pete Willis is on here because he'd already recorded the rhythm guitars along with the other guitarist at the time. And yeah, so it's interesting to see how that was blended in, and we'll just talk about that in a moment. But that's what was going on, and we're pre the whole terrible accident as well that occurred sometime after this, and obviously held up the release of Hysteria considerably during recuperation and sort of relearning the drums. So I'm going to quickly just place this also against Mutt Lange's timeline, because I get confused about this. I often think mistakenly that Mutt Lange, this was his first album, if I don't look it up. For some reason I misremember it, but he was actually producing the band for High and Dry. The first album, which he didn't produce, was produced by Tom Allen. Yeah, so he was on board at the time of High and Dry, recorded with them Pyromania and then Hysteria. But he was also producing AC/DC. He just started producing them, I think, as of Highway to Hell. He did Back in Black, did For Those About to Rock. Also Foreigner, their big album Foreigner 4. Waking Up the Neighbours. That's a lot later, that's 91. But looking at this, you can sort of see the albums that Mutt Lange was involved with. He did, I think, 3 of the Boomtown Rats albums just prior to that as well. So there's a number of bands here that were kicking around at the time of sort of new wave. There's quite a few City Boy albums as well. So looking at the Def Leppard discography, it's interesting, as this happened with a lot of bands. I've mentioned this before, in that, when I first started listening to albums in the 70s, it became obvious within a lot of cases that bands were releasing an album a year. If you were lucky, maybe 2. And then that release schedule got stretched out. Now, obviously, with Def Leppard, it is impacted by that car accident in, after 1983 that held up Hysteria. But generally, you have tended to see over the years from 70s into the 80s, 80s into 90s, where releases of albums the gaps between them seem to get bigger. And that's also true, as you can see here, of Def Leppard. 10 tracks on Pyromania. You can see here it mentions that Coming Under Fire and Action Not Words are listed inversely on the original Mercury vinyl release, but they play in the order above. So on the album they play in this order, but when you look at the back of the Mercury vinyl release, they're in a different order. It's a long time since I've looked at my vinyl copy of this. I should actually check and see if it's the case with the copy I've got. I mean, I did buy it when it came out, so possibly. Yeah, and just here, so we got Steve Clark's the other guitarist. Pete Willis was ousted around the time of this album, but he'd already recorded rhythm tracks, so Phil Collen comes in as his replacement, adds in additional stuff that still needed to be done, did some backing vocals, and then did guitar solos on all the tracks. Because if you were familiar with Def Leppard before this, it was one of these two guitar bands where the guitarist would be both rhythm and lead, and they would sort of trade guitars. Now it makes a point, and I don't know whether to cover this now. I think I'll talk about it now actually. So to me this album, just generally style-wise, was a pivotal album, in that you started to hear, I think they refer to it here as a sort of more radio friendly from their heavy metal roots. Now the only qualification I have for this is, I'm pretty familiar with the whole Nwubum scene when it happened. So if you take notice of the Saxon song Denim and Leather, and they talk about where were you in 79 when the dam began to burst, I think that's the line. I started listening to the Friday Rock Show in 79, so I was sort of seeing that movement change before my eyes. But what was interesting is the whole Nwubum, the new wave of British heavy metal as it's abbreviated to, that term that I think was originally coined by Sounds back in the day. To me, that it was a pretty loose group of bands, and you could definitely sort of trace lineage back to the more heavier bands like, the Sabbaths of this world in terms of the heavy metal roots. And then there was that sort of that sound that by then, although they predate Nwubum, bands like Judas Priest had developed. They had a certain sound about them. And obviously there were bands that had developed from that, but then there was quite a lot of bands within the movement that to me was stronger, had closer musical ties to bands like UFO and Thin Lizzy, who were more of a hard rock, heavy rock sound, particularly in the case of Thin Lizzy, where you've got that sort of twin guitar sound, and it's sort of super melodic, and also you've got guitarists that are trading, so not dissimilar to what Judas Priest did, but they definitely had a harder edge sound, more sort of titanium or whatever you want, that crisper. I'm trying to think of a good word for that, but if you've listened to late 70s Judas Priest, as the songs got down to tighter things, you'll know the sort of sound that they had around that time. And within that pool of music, that genre, definitely the bands I was listening to, it was a really diverse set of sounds, and you could definitely hear bands that were much, much closer to the UFOs and the Mott the Hooples and the Thin Lizzies than were the Sabbaths. And to me, Def Leppard were one of those bands that were more in that hard rock area, even from the get-go. I know there were a lot of songs on the first album that were a lot longer and had more of those sort of convoluted structures to them that you sort of associated with like traditional heavy metal, certainly in the UK anyway. The other thing that they brought to the mix, and a lot of bands at that time, Girl as well, was, a nod back to glam. So they were bringing that into the mix. So it's really no surprise that they spun off in the direction that they did, into this what's called here more radio friendly sound. Now what's very telling is when you look at whether or not how people responded to that in the UK. And obviously at that point, they had 2 albums out. A lot of those bands were relying on their hardcore fans to get them in the charts. But something interesting happened in the case, or rather tragically in the case of Def Leppard, that wasn't of their own making, because they were just, obviously creating the style of music that they wanted to create and they felt would, bring them success. But they got lambasted in the UK press, particularly in sounds. Between the release of their first album and their appearance at the Reading Festival, they had definitely started to become interested in, not surprisingly, developing their American sales. And for some reason, when there was a particular journalist in sounds, his name escapes me, who took that particularly badly, and they got quite a sort of scathing article written on sounds about how they'd sold out and various other things, and that really affected their how people saw them within the sort of that community of music fans in the UK. I mean, really did. And we'll see in a moment how I think that affected the sales. But that's my sort of take on it from the time. And you can see here, there's a big disparity. Like, this, even the third album, this is before Hysteria, it ultimately goes diamond in the US, but it's kicking around at silver in the UK. And their single success in the UK is pretty patchy up until Hysteria. So let's just delve a bit deeper into that. So on Album of the Year, if you look at popularity as it's ranked on there, this is the order. And this doesn't surprise me. If I was to sort of try and guess, it would be like reverse chronological from the release of Hysteria. For me, if you ask me what my favourite Def Leppard albums are, I suppose I just hark back to the old days, because I am aware, simply because they got played a lot on the Friday Rock Show, particularly like things like the Bludgeon Riffola EP and the sessions they did. So I have a particular soft spot for this album. One of the reasons could be that I played this a lot when I went on holiday in Cornwall, I think. Quite a bit later from when this came out. I bought this on vinyl when it came out, but I remember playing this a lot when I got my first car, so I have fond memories of that. I bought this album retrospectively, but not long after this, and I think one of my brothers actually had it. So I was aware of this, but I didn't buy this when it came out, but this I did. I bought this when it came out and this when it came out. So if you ask me my favourite order of the albums, it's this album, then this one, then this, then this. I did really like this when it came out. I was really impressed by just how how the album sounded, how it was recorded. I was really interested in. I played it a lot when I was out walking, constantly on my Walkman. But over time, definitely I go back to my original favourite order, which is this, and then this. But yeah, it's different for everyone. If we look at the album, so let me just switch that. We'll go back to the singles in a moment. So here's Pyromania on the UK charts, and you can see sort of what I'm talking about. So it gets up to number 18. It's on the chart for 8 weeks. Doesn't get to number 1, obviously. Prior to that, On Through the Night had actually done better. So their first album had actually got to number 15. It was on the chart for 8 weeks. So same number of weeks, but higher position. High and Dry only got to number 26. So I think that effect of that, like, bad review, whatever you want to talk about it, in sounds, really had an impact between these two albums. And I know when they played Reading after this album was released, and after that article in Sounds was put out, they got, canned at Reading really badly, by all accounts. I wasn't there. I did hear the recording of it, and they sounded, I thought, really good. But but it wasn't due to the performance, I don't think. It was just the sentiment at the time. Unfortunately, people are sort of easily led by popular opinion, or the opinion of what would then be influences in the music press. But then we get into Hysteria period, and the UK have sort of caught up again. So we got number 1, only 1 week, but 108 weeks. So yeah. Singles wise, you can see, they had Wasted was in, well, again, nothing really scratched the top 40 until Animal was released. Now, Wasted was released prior to that first album, so that's probably just due to the album not being that well known. But I again wonder if, you've got a track like Hello America. It would have been fine without that article. That really, put the boot in, I suppose. So this is the run on the initial run on the UK charts. It just goes in, it's top 40 for 2 weeks, and then just slides back out again. But the other problem you've got, I think, you could argue that the golden years for NWBM, New Wave of British Heavy Metal, on the UK charts was probably like 80, 81 into 82. And what we were starting to see is a whole new set of like alternative rock, sort of Celtic rock groups that were starting to be in the ascendancy in 83. You got the new romantic movement as well, which was, to all intents and purposes, the complete antithesis of hard rock and everything above that. So it's no surprise that they were also probably contending with that. And so if we look back sort of from where they are, and we go back to number 1, you can see you've got War by U2, Thriller, which we've looked at previously, that was still in the charts. Thunder and Lightning had just been released. That was What's Thin Lizzy's last studio album with Phil Lynott. Dazzle Ships by OMD, Eurythmics we spoke about last week. We've got Toto 4, Spandau Ballet's True, Jane Fonda's Workout was doing well in the charts at that point. So there was a lot to compete with as well. There's Rio, Duran Duran was coming down the charts. But, if you're familiar with bands that were very much aligned with the new romantic movement, and other bands that were, still rock bands, but just had would get on the charts, you can see what they're sort of competing with. If we look at the singles, the way I've done it this time round is because it singles wise, because of the US popularity at that time, things get super interesting. So I'm going to do it from this grid instead of just the usual single article, and then we'll just jump in for each one. So if I go back here, so Bringing on the Heartbreak was on the previous album, High and Dry. They released Photograph. In the UK, it only gets to number 66, doesn't even scratch the top 40. In the US rock charts, it's number 1. Even on the US charts, it's 12. Now, of course, MTV had a big part to play in all of this as well. In the UK, really your only exposure for videos, I think at that point, would have been Top of the Pops. So that, really helped. Their timing was perfect. In fact, they were producing videos, promo videos. That really helped them. So the era of Twisted Sister, to me, this will always be, and that's the way I think of it. So I believe this was the first single. If you look at its UK charts performance, oops, I was there already. Doesn't even scratch the top 40. But what was it alongside in the charts? So that got into the charts. So its highest position in the charts was the same week as Kajagoogoo, Men at Work, Changed by Tears for Fears. So this was the 13th of February 1983. So it comes out the month after the album's release. So the album takes a couple of months to appear in the UK album charts. The single takes about a month but doesn't get into the top 40. But it's just contending with a very rock averse charts in some way, or however you want to think of it, classic rock, or I was trying to think of the best term for this. Now again, you're getting what would be seen as back then like UK indie bands doing reasonably well, but alongside a lot of other stuff, Cold Sweat's in the charts, that's doing quite well. But then Thin Lizzy did, once the sort of mid-70s onwards, were getting a lot of chart success, so they were just still riding on that, even though probably they weren't doing as well as they once did. And then Eurythmics, so pretty, I think antagonistic charts is what I'm looking for as well. Didn't help. So next single, we got Rock of Ages. Just misses getting to the top 40. Number 1 on the US rock chart, 16 on the US charts. So issued in the UK and the US. Again, there's only about four weeks on the top 75, because at that point that's what the singles charts was in the UK. That was the maximum position that was reported if you could get hold of the top 75 charts, which I think you could see at record stores. But the chart rundown was only ever the top 40, so didn't even feature on that. I just don't remember any of these singles actually being played anywhere apart from the Friday Rock Show in the UK, personally. And then let's just do this. There we go. 28th of August. So a bit later. When did that come out? That came out in May. The original. May, June, July, August. Wow. Okay. Quite a big delay then. Yeah, we're in full new romantic jazz funk era, I suppose. See, Genesis is still doing well. Got Kraftwerk with Tour de France. That's probably what I remember most from that period. Would have been Red Wine. Oh, This Rocket by Herbie Hancock. I had that album. Okay, and then finally from the UK lens, we got Too Late for Love. Hopefully I did get that right. Yep. Gets a bit confusing because you can see here there's an airplay thing going on from in the US perspective. So it's making this US rock chart, but it's sort of to do with airplay. So we have these airplay things where they're playing tracks off the album. The B-side to Coming Under Fire. Billy's Got a Gun, Action Not Words. This was released as a single, but I'm unsure as to whether this got a UK release. I don't think it did. I think it was US only, and it would imply... I'm trying to remember what their UK record company was at the time. But if it did, it didn't make the UK charts. So Too Late for Love, well, again, 86. So, wow. So at this point, there was a top... It's all right, I'm just make sure I haven't contradicted myself here. I wonder if there was a change and they were starting to list... Oh no, it was... Oh, I stand corrected, sorry about that. For some reason I thought that the singles charts was still only the top 75, but clearly it isn't. Yep, so correction there. Yep, so the singles charts and the album charts are both top hundreds. Okay. Not that it really makes a lot of difference, but yeah, because like I said, in the UK, really, if you didn't make the top 40, then you probably weren't going to get any sort of play on regular radio. You get played on Friday Rock Show, but you get played anyway, regardless of whether you're releasing singles. As long as you've got albums out, then Tommy Vance, wanted to play them. So yeah, 88 and 86. So let's just have a quick look here. Yeah, another music video. There's a lot of music videos off this album. And there again, so we're now into December of 83. Yeah. What can I say? At this point, I was definitely still very much listening. Oh yeah, we had Bark of the Moon by Ozzy Osbourne out. That's what I would have been listening to. Yeah, I was still very much in, the area of like rock bands of that period. I hadn't quite moved over to listening to a lot of U2 or Big Country quite yet. But yeah, that's something that more happened in sort of 84, 85. And some of this stuff I listen to retrospectively, like the Eurythmics. And of course, yeah, Simple Minds Waterfront as well. So you definitely had these, whatever you want to call it, Celtic rock bands, like modern rock bands. The Smiths as well, This Charming Man. So you're starting to see, a lot of indie bands, UK indie bands coming in the charts. You've got Yes, that really... big hit they had with Owner of a Lonely Heart. And there were a few bands that were getting a second wind, like Yes. Also, you notice that Slade here, they, off the back of an appearance they did, funnily enough, Slade played Reading. I don't know if it was the same year. What happened was there was the Reading Festival, which is a big UK festival. That the two big ones back then were if you liked sort of hard rock, and above, if you like. The two big festivals were Reading Festival and the Monsters of Rock, which was originally at Castle Donington. And that started around about 1980, I think. But Reading had been running for years. And what happened was there was a year when Ozzy was supposed to play, but cancelled. And I don't know, I can't remember if it was as a result of the tragedy that happened with Randy Rhoads or not. I think it might have been. But anyway, he pulled out from the festival. And as a special guest, because I think he was special guest anyway, they had to pull someone in. So they persuaded Slade, who at that point were not doing well at all. But Slade had a reputation for being a really good live band. And they went down really well at the Reading Festival. They just play this sort of no-nonsense like rock, you know, with glam elements in it, and they played all their hits, and like I said, they were known to be a really good band live. So they sort of won over what could have been a quite a sort of crowd that wouldn't have been, you know, obviously a lot of people had gone there to see Ozzy, and I'm not sure how close to the festival that he wasn't going to play that got announced. But what was fascinating is, as a result of that, they had a second career and had a spate of albums in the early 80s that did really well, and single success that did really well, going through to like 83 and later. And they went for a bit more of a polished, they were already quite melodic, but there was a certain change made to their sound. That the riffs were pretty melodic at that point, and were proving popular with people that were into a lot of heavier stuff as well, and people that had older members of, if you like, the hard rock heavy metal community that remember Slade back when they were this glam band that had chart success. So there's a bit of a nostalgia in there as well. So it was mixed in with this mixture of maybe people who discovered them from the first time, and all the old fans sort of coming back. And yeah, they were having singles chart success right in the middle of, New Romantic period, alongside bands like Genesis, who got a second wind, and as I mentioned, Yes. And I'm trying to remember the point at which, was it the band Asia? I can't remember how big success they had in the UK, but yeah, there was several of what you would call originally bands that were prog bands who had chart success, but for different reasons, now having chart success again, in amongst all this other stuff that they didn't really share any musical commonality with. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating times, that period from like 1980 into 83, 84 maybe, where you're getting that transition from the more traditional rock bands into indie, but also this background New Romantic scene as well. So yeah, it's a pretty cool period to live through, and certainly it was interesting for me because musically I had a major change, 84 into 85, where I started to sort of embrace bands like Big Country, U2, started to get into bands like Sisters of Mercy, a lot of the goth bands that were popular around that time, and bands that were getting some chart success who'd been kicking around for quite a while, bands like sort of Killing Joke and that as well. So it's always one of the reasons why I like doing these episodes, as I think I've said, we're getting into the sort of albums that I cover, going to be stuff that's released in 83, 93, 2003, 73, and there's a lot of stuff out that I have real fond memories either of the time or retrospectively, in the case of a lot of albums from 73. I won't mention any because I'm bound to make mistakes, but I'm already in my head, I'm thinking, there's a lot of cool albums that came out in 73 that are now like 50 years old. So yeah, I'm looking forward to what's going to come up. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.